So tonight we're here to talk about homegrown energy. That encompasses technological innovations, political hurdles, technological hurdles, the economics of the growing uses of renewables, and how Australia can tap into all of that better. This is not just a discussion about solar panels and Tesla batteries. And tonight we have here to discuss this a very eminent panel with huge brains who spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff. Miriam Lyons is a policy analyst. She's a commentator and renewable energy campaigner with GetUp. She also has an extensive career in public policy. And Miriam is the reason that there are the banners and the people that you saw as you walked in tonight. We'll get more onto that in a minute. Ross Garnaut is one of Australia's leading economists. His latest book is Dog Days, Australia After the Boom. It's sitting on my bookshelf waiting to be read. Don't take that personally, Ross. I will get to it, I promise. And Veena Sahajwalla is professor. She's one of the world's leading innovators in the field of sustainable materials use, and she's an international award-winning scientist and energy engineer. And she's the founding director of the Sustainable Materials Research and Technology Centre at the University of New South Wales. SMART Centre, it's one of those awesome acronyms. And her research has resulted in the production of green steel, which she will talk about. And I was going to start with Miriam to explain the homegrown energy plan, which has been launched today by GetUp. But let's mix things up a little and go to the gentleman in the middle who had his hand up there for the first question.
This is to the panel at large. How far, as your collective minds know, how far advanced is battery technology for storage, and most importantly, for the rate of recharge, which is critical for vehicles, but also important if you collect electricity from your roof and you store it? How quickly, how far advanced is it? I've heard through Quantum that there is a battery now that can charge about 3 or 4 times faster than any existing one. How truthful is that? And what do you know about battery recharge and the state of batteries now?
Who would like to answer that one? Ross?
Yes, battery technology is advancing very quickly, and really you can have the battery discharge as rapidly as you want to, just by having a higher ratio of power through the inverter to energy, which is the storage capacity of the battery. In some parts of the world, it's becoming very common to balance a lot of renewable energy, which is intermittent, or at least wind and solar are intermittent, and they can quite suddenly break off if the wind stops blowing or the cloud comes over, and a battery can kick in a nanosecond and can immediately fill a very large gap. So at some price, it can be as fast as you'd like. Costs of the big batteries are coming down very quickly. In the last 3 years, the costs have fallen of the batteries themselves by about a half. They'll keep on falling for some time, probably not quite at that rate. But we're at the point where, for many uses, battery technology is at a stage where it's economic. In some uses, it's not yet, but will be in future. It depends on particular circumstances.
Did I mention that we've got a Tesla Powerwall as a lucky door prize tonight? No, we don't really. I was just joking. I was just teasing you. All right, Miriam. So look, let's just get so people who haven't actually had a chance to read the materials that you've given here today, but you are launching. GetUp is launching the Homegrown Power Plan today. So talk us about that, because it's quite a big forward-thinking document. So just tell us what the thrust of that is.
So this is a big joint project between GetUp and Solar Citizens, who also have a banner out the back tonight, and also between us and the Institute for Sustainable Futures, who did a whole bunch of modelling, which we released today, looking essentially at how fast we could get to 100% renewable power in Australia and how fast we could get up to 100% renewable energy across all sectors, transport, industry, everything, and also what the cost implications of that would be. So what they found is great news, guys. We can get to 100% renewable power for all our homes and businesses by 2030. By 2035, we can also have 40% of our transport sector powered by renewables. And by 2050, we can decarbonise the entire energy sector. So that means, anything hauling freight, taking a flight, we can power all of that with clean, renewable energy from the wind, sun, and other sources.
And what
so that's
mountains-
pretty exciting.
In a way, what you guys have been talking about, and bringing it right back to the question there about battery technology, I think the important thing for us to bear in mind is that when we're talking about renewables, coupling that with developments in battery technology is going to be absolutely critical. So, historically, if you go back and have a look at, all the changes that have taken place in where our knowledge is right now with batteries, and everyone sort of looks at lithium-ion batteries and that technology and says, right, here it is. But the reality is there's been an evolution of different types of materials. So, prior to that with nickel metal hydride batteries and so on. So you've got a whole sort of sequence of changes that have taken place, which is fantastic. So it goes back to Ross's point around the fact that price of these materials that go into actually making batteries is important. Because remember, that's the critical thing. How do you sort of couple the demand for efficiencies and high efficiencies with our ability to actually deliver it at a low cost level? And really that's where the critical question comes in. So, do you have the capacity to store energy? Now we're talking about not just households, but, even with vehicles. But then you extend that out further and go, okay, if you actually had industries, and picture this, industries that are totally dependent right now on fossil fuel, actually starting to think about the use of batteries as a way for them to even imagine how they might reconfigure the way traditional industries do work, and to be able to adapt that into their thinking is going to be important. So it's not just about whether do we have the technology now, it's going to be about what types of technologies are the right technologies to meet our needs, whether it's talking about needs in a household context or whether it's meeting our needs in an industrial context.
So that's the technological aspect, but there are many more mountains to move, aren't there, before we get to 100% renewables by 2030. So what are some of those mountains that you've outlined, Miriam, in the report?
So three main things. One, we need to completely reboot how our electricity market works. So we have a market that was really designed for an old energy era. Its whole rules, its institutions are all set up around the idea that you will have a handful of big fossil-fueled generators feeding energy one way along the grid to a whole bunch of passive consumers. These rules weren't set up for an era when we've got, an Australian household installing solar on their rooftop every 3 minutes, where we've got 1.5 million households that have solar already, and a hell of a lot more that want it, and a hell of a lot more that can
Half
have
of them
it.
are in this room, I think,
Yeah.
judging by earlier.
Exactly. And because solar PV is now cheaper than retail electricity, we are going to see that expand, and we just have a system that is not designed to deal with that. So one of the things that we are arguing for is to rewrite the National Electricity Objective, which is kind of the one sentence that rules them all. Literally, it's like a single sentence that everyone who currently has the power to make day-to-day decisions about how the whole system works refers to when they're making those decisions. And at the moment, that sentence, it doesn't have climate change in it, it doesn't have equity or fairness in it, it doesn't even have affordability to consumers in it. I think that actually explains a lot about why the entire system that we have has, really been kind of driving with its eyes in the rearview mirror and kind of failing to grapple with the fact that, we've essentially got this unstoppable force of a renewable energy revolution. So we're arguing, let's put what everybody agrees is inevitable, which is the decarbonisation of our energy sector, into the national electricity objective. So that's one of the things. That's just like the top line recommendation from one of the bits of the report.
It's a 60,000 word report.
It's a bit of a chunky document.
Yeah.
There's some other stuff that we need to do as well. So one of the things that's really exciting, I think, is that because of the nature of renewable technology, yes, we need a lot of big stuff, but we're also going to have a lot of small stuff. And the exciting thing about spreading the power to generate electricity amongst way more hands is that, as well as decentralising our power sector, we can also democratise it. We can have the benefits of our electricity sector shared by far more people, so that's exciting. But there are some people who are currently locked out of that. So a lot of people are renting, there's people in public housing, there's people in apartments who currently don't have access to renewables, who don't have access to the ability to kind of fight back against the huge fees and charges imposed by the network companies doing unnecessary gold plating of the grid by putting solar on their rooftops. So we're arguing for a few policies that would help expand that kind of clean, affordable energy access to more households. The big thing is we really need to shut down some of the old, polluting, dirty coal-fired power that was built on the taxpayer's dime decades ago, and that is a big part of the reason that you have such a tiny but very potent voice in Australian politics fighting against the rise of renewables. They know that every time renewables expand, it's eating their business model for lunch. Nothing can compete with written off old coal-fired generation that was built on the taxpayer's dime a long time ago, that got cheap access to a very expensive electricity network to the grid. So nothing can compete with that, including new coal-fired generation.
Okay. So there are a number of ways that people can consider going about that. I'll go to questions in just one second, but Ross, I just wanted to ask you from the economist's point of view. I mean, coal has brought Australia many great things, hasn't it? It's brought us the lifestyle that we all currently enjoy, largely. And is it desirable from a macroeconomic point of view to be running solely on renewables by 2030?
Sensible macroeconomics takes into account feedback from climate change. So that would be so costly for Australia. If the world wasn't doing something about climate change, then we would pay an immense cost for that. Mm-hmm. And those costs would, over time, overwhelm any extra cost from energy. So from that climate change perspective, there's an overwhelmingly economic case for early transition. For Australia being part of a global effort, and the rest of the world is making the effort. The question is, will we try to stop the rest of the world by being a laggard, or will we just join it like everyone else is doing?
I just wanted to clear up that economic question, because that's always one of the big points.
But if you ignored the economics of climate change, and I think that would be a really strange thing to do, but if you did, it is true that part of the Australian standard of living in the past was helped along by our easy access to the developed world's cheapest coal resources and some of the cheapest gas resources. But it's quite a while since, it's at least 5 years since coal and gas were adding positively to our incomes. The peak of coal, the last of the grand old years of coal, was 2011. We've invested, firms in Australia have invested $250 billion in expanding output of coal, gas, iron ore in the resources boom since the Chinese model of economic growth changed in 2011 and undercut the economic case for that investment. So all of that investment's now making us poorer. Our superannuation funds have had money in coal enterprise since 2011. They've lost a lot of money. If a lot of the major coal companies that were worth a lot in 2011 are worth next to nothing now. Some of the biggest are in bankruptcy. So if your superannuation fund is invested in those, you're poorer. So the time when the fossil fuels was adding to our wealth has passed. And I think Australians would do well to focus on the opportunity that Australia will have looking forward in a low-carbon world economy. Because while we're the richest of the developed countries in the old fossil energy, especially coal and gas, we're richer by even a larger margin in per capita terms in the resources for renewable energy. Very few places have the combinations of high quality wind and solar that we have close to each other in southern Australia. And as you go up the Queensland coast, you've got some quite extraordinary biomass opportunities alongside wind and solar. When I was doing my climate change review, I was visited by the director of the German solar program back in 2007. That was then the biggest solar program in the world, since been passed by China and will soon be passed by India. But he was a little bit distressed. He said, I'm having to run the world's biggest solar program, and I've been travelling around Australia. I've discovered that the worst place in Australia for renewable energy is the west coast of Tasmania, and that's better than the best place in Germany. That translates into economic benefits. It means that when the whole world is getting its energy from renewable sources, as the leaders of the developed world have pledged to have done by 2050, then they'll all be putting a lot of high-cost renewable energy into their grids. We can have lower-cost renewable energy because our resources are better, and that gives us a competitive advantage in the low-carbon world economy of the future.
All right, let's have questions. Okay. Oh my goodness. Okay, who was first? That way? Yes, thank you.
Miriam, I suspect many people in this room would be familiar with the Zero Carbon Australia Stationary Energy Report, which was a real landmark and a real talking point, a real focus. It estimated, I think it was at least 6 years ago, that the cost for that transition to totally renewables would be about 380 billion, if I'm correct. Your report, if I understand it, is saying about 870 billion. Can you talk to us about the differences? Is it covering the same thing? Did they overestimate cost drops, or is the energy required now estimated to be more?
So one of the things that the Institute for Sustainable Futures Modelling did was integrate energy across all sectors and look at how they interact. So for example, because they're looking at a pathway to 100% total energy becoming renewable across everything, including transport, one of the things that means is a lot of extra electric vehicles plugging into the grid. That massively increases demand for electricity. As you convert some other processes over to electricity, that also increases electricity demand. And what they found was that means basically $800 billion of investment between now and 2030, compared to $150 billion of investment in the electricity sector alone from now out to 2050. Right? But because you don't have to keep on shoveling coal into a wind turbine and you don't have to pour petrol into the tank of your Tesla, we save a hell of a lot on fuel costs. And the savings on fuel costs add up to 110% of the additional investment in renewables between now and 2050.
Got it? All right. Next question.
Looking in the rear vision mirror for a moment, could somebody, any of the panel, tell me about the current subsidy structure for the non-renewable sector, the fossil sector? What was the justification for it? How big is it? Surely it's massively vulnerable to public opinion if it's understood.
Who wants to have a go?
Well, there are many elements of subsidy, and of course these can be looked at in different ways, so they're controversial. But the biggest hunk of subsidy is the hugely expensive network that we have, which is necessary to take power from a big centralised power station out to all of the users. We've spent, since 2006, when our current regulatory framework, criticised by Miriam, was introduced, we've spent $87 billion, our energy companies have, in expanding the capacity of the grid so it's able to take more power from those big centralised power stations to people's homes or businesses. In that time, power consumption's actually fallen. So the $87 billion question is, why did we need any of that? And there are lots of other subsidies, but the biggest one is the wasteful overinvestment in the grid, which of course is not necessary if you've got decentralised power. The future of an efficient, an efficient zero carbon electricity system, and as Miriam's report shows, will not be to do away with the grid altogether. You'll have a mixture of central and decentralised facilities, but it will be a much smaller and less expensive grid, because the decentralisation of some power supply to households, to small towns and so on, will mean you just don't need that heavy investment. And starting to look at that in a truly economic way, instead of just piling on the investment because proposals have been put forward by the old energy companies, will save Australians a lot of money.
And can I just ask why the government continues to be so enthralled by the old energy companies?
There's a very deep relationship between the fossil fuel lobby and Australian politics at all levels of government. And on the network side of things, I mean, the networks are still about as close to a natural monopoly as you can get. And when, natural monopolies, I believe, should usually be held in public hands. There are a whole lot of sound economic reasons that tends to make sense. But when they're in private hands, we rely on regulators to make sure that they're run in the public interest and that they don't abuse their market power. And basically, our regulators took their eye off the game, for a whole bunch of complicated reasons. Some of them are boring to explain, but basically, the way that decisions are made about what gets spent on what poles and wires where come down to a battle of consultants at 20 paces, and the big guys have a lot more money to spend on consultants. I think that New South Wales and Queensland are culpable for not running the companies they owned in the public interest, but essentially milking them as cash cows and fattening them up for market for being, sold or leased. So that's a problem. But across the board, we have not had these natural monopolies being run in the public interest as a public good. And I think that's been a massive problem. And it's one of the things that we look at figuring out how to tackle.
And I don't think we should forget a very basic problem of our democracy, and I'm afraid the democracies of most developed countries, but it's worse in Australia than in most developed countries, and that's the role of money in politics. The energy interests have financed all of our major political parties, A lot of the relationships on financing of politics are not at all transparent. The most crude example of this, we had a very efficient, very effective set of carbon mitigation policies in place for 2 years, from 2012 to 2014, July the 1st, 2012 to June the 30th, 2014. Emissions were coming down solidly in that time, including in the electricity sector. That was abolished, and since 2014 we haven't had it. The vote in the Senate that allowed the abolition of carbon pricing was a very close one. The balance of power, the 3 votes that swung it, were the votes of the Palmer United Party, which were bought by a $27 million investment taken out of a dirty Queensland nickel refinery.
Hang on. Defamation, my journalist defamation goes ping, ping, ping.
Ross is absolutely right. I mean, we don't just need to get the polluters out of our power sector. We need to get polluters out of our politics, and we need to get their money out of our politics. And a 350.org has a fantastic campaign going on that at the moment. I encourage everybody to go along and sign up to it. If you want to find out about GetUp's strategy for booting some of the key climate blocker friends of the fossil fuel lobby out of political life, then come up and talk to us at the table at the back afterwards.
But I guess,
It's gonna be one of the focuses of our election campaign.
We've talked about a lot of sort of, I mean, and it's good to be aware of, where the sort of negative implications of the actions that we've taken in the past. And when I say we here, we're sort of talking about broadly as Australia. But we also should stop and recognise where there are positive actions being taken by industry sectors, despite the fact that there's not been entirely the support coming through policy and other measures. So it's interesting. I mean, you look at a lot of sectors that effectively in Australia that have taken positive steps that have then benefited out of some of these actions. So for instance, if they've actually taken steps towards, basically adopting renewable strategies. So it's not just around energy, but it's also around materials. And I guess that's been an important sort of holistic solution and really cutting edge solutions that Australian, I guess, businesses have adopted. So I think sometimes also we've got to go back and as much as we can look at that in the rearview mirror, but also say, well, what can we learn from that? Are there opportunities there that teach us about what the future should look like in terms of truly a future that is, a zero carbon future? Because let's face it, there are so many different types of industry sectors that rely upon fossil resources. But what other resources are businesses using? And I think I'd like to particularly bring to the attention of, using waste resources has resulted actually in a lot of businesses being very clever and smart and basically reducing their carbon intensity, reducing energy consumption. So effectively delivering, the green solutions, both green energy solution as well as green material solution.
You better tell us about the little vial that you've got there in your hand.
Yeah, right. I guess I was sort of said, it happened to be in my bag. So I said, right, I'm going to bring this out. And I guess leading on from what I was just saying, what this actually is we've managed to be able to produce high quality copper metal from electronic waste. And that's really in a way where, the story that I was mentioning around the opportunities that deliver green materials and green energies off the back of waste. So if you actually start to think about the sun can deliver green energy, so could waste materials deliver, basically green materials? And I guess that's really the ultimate question. And if we could truly get to entirely a renewable scenario in the future, that would have to be based on both green energy as well as green materials. So, renewables from an energy perspective, as well as waste effectively giving us the opportunity to be able to create green materials. But I guess what it then means is Australia can play a vital role in developing new strategies. And that's what we've actually managed to achieve here. Why is that so important? Because you might say, well, gee, yeah, of course, recycling waste, that's a good thing to do. We divert waste from landfill. And sure, that's one way to look at it. And that's clearly an obvious thing that we all should be doing. But I think the other inherent part of it, which is not so apparent when you talk about, looking at waste as a resource for green materials, is the fact that when you're actually recycling materials, so in this instance, when I'm using, electronic waste to be able to produce copper, you're actually saving on significant levels of energy because there's so much energy that's embedded in these types of metals that you can actually bring it back to life over and over again. And effectively, it's about, keeping that energy in your hands. So if we are sitting on resources that we all have in our hands, our phones and TVs and computers at home and offices, effectively at the end of their life, they are nothing but resources of green materials. And that's exciting possibility because it saves on both the waste, but also effectively, creates a whole new scenario around what could renewables look like in the future, both creating green energy as well as green materials. So that's what's
so
quite
it's
exciting.
two halves of the same whole that
Yeah,
you're
absolutely.
effectively
I
talking
think it's
about.
really
Yep.
exciting. Let's become a renewable energy superpower and a renewable
And green materials,
green materials superpower.
totally,
Exactly.
totally, yeah.
All right, ushers, who is next? Yes, please. We might head down the back as well to give the people down the back to have a chance.
Hi, I'm just remodelling my kitchen and getting rid of the last gas appliance in the house. So I'll be going off the gas grid very soon. So I'll be actually asking for more electricity from the grid. Now, your premise tonight is to move to a 100% Australia from renewable energy. Why stop there?
Yeah, let's go to 300%.
Let's go to 500%.
Yeah,
let's go to 1,000%
Yeah.
and export, instead of digging up coal once and exporting it through the Great Barrier Reef. Produce renewable energy and export that day after day after day into Southeast Asia. We can do this.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you've probably also read the amazing Beyond Zero Emissions report, the Renewable Energy Superpower report. Great work. Let's do it. Like Ross was saying before, we do have a competitive advantage. Australia is the sunniest continent on Earth. We're one of the windiest. You know, this is a natural advantage that will stay with us, unlike a whole bunch of holes in the ground. So yes, absolutely. Let's go to 100% and then let's go beyond it and start building renewable, affordable renewable energy into our exports. One of the things that's quite exciting from the Institute for Sustainable Futures work is in looking out beyond 2030, the importance of synthetic fuels in providing some of, getting all the way out into the last tendrils of the energy sector that are kind of hard to electrify. And you can take renewable energy, use it to make synthetic fuels. That's something that we could potentially export. There's a whole bunch of things that I think that Australia could do if we just started to, take our mind off the past and look at how we build the advantages of the future.
And
But
it's interesting.
wind farms are so ugly. I mean, but realistically, isn't that what you're up against? Fundamentally, you're up against what is essentially a very hostile government at this point in time towards renewables.
Well, they're less hostile than they used to be, and let's not forget that is because that previously extremely hostile, actively attempting to abolish the renewable energy industry effectively, was vastly unpopular because renewables are vastly popular. I mean, it wasn't the only reason they were unpopular. There were a whole lot of things that Tony Abbott did right.
Sorry, being interrupted.
I was just making the point that in all of this, let's not ignore the fact that Australia actually is already a leader when it comes to a whole range of different R&D areas. So when it comes to research, we are a pretty smart and clever country. So effectively, we could realistically take all of these things that we're sort of saying, why aren't we doing this and why aren't we doing that? You know what? The realities are that off the back of our amazing research work that happens within research sectors, we could be taking all of these innovations, whether it comes, off the back of materials or energy sectors, and really transforming the science into amazing technological advances. And I think that's really where we can actually take our smarts and go, you know what? We're going to be exporting, if we wish to, not only all of these renewables that we're going to be generating, we should be exporting our intellectual services and teaching the rest of the world how to do it. And that's really where we can get mileage out of our intelligence. Let's share that intelligence out with the rest of the world and teach the world off the back of our R&D how things can be improved and how we can do things better. Because let's face it, time's running out. So let's, be pretty clever about it. And I think that's the nice thing we can do, particularly if we are going to share our intelligence and the technological advances, with developing regions who so desperately need.
Okay, question down the back, please.
Just very quickly following up on that. That is one of the reasons that the funding of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency is so important, because it is investing in that research that could be something that we are exporting to the world in the future. We kind of already know how to switch over to renewables in the power sector, but there is a whole lot of other stuff where innovation could make a massive difference. We're supposed to have an innovation prime minister. Why is he taking the funding away from the agency that is supposed to fund innovative clean energy?
Okay, the question down the back, thank you.
My question, Wendy Farmer, I'm actually from Latrobe Valley, where we have the 4 dirtiest power stations. Don't hit me now. What the question is, and I will comment on your windmills, have you ever looked at the power stations and the dirt that's coming out of that? Their other statement, coal's good for humanity. Well, why then is the areas that have coal mines are usually the lowest socio-economic areas in the areas? My question, though, is because I do come from Latrobe Valley, all power lines run from Latrobe Valley that supply Victoria. Do you look to the future and see that we could use those grids as a massive battery storage area? We're putting energy back into the grid. is there a way of putting that energy into a massive battery storage or some sort of storage and then feeding it back through the grids for that reliable power? I know at the moment our group is working on looking at a state energy innovation centre to be set up in Latrobe Valley. We see Daniel Andrews on Friday announce that he is going to make the mines responsible for rehabilitating their mines, and they will have full bonds to cover that. You know, I think he can be congratulated on looking at that. But, you know, can Latrobe Valley be that state centre with the battery storage to feed the grids?
That's... Go, sure.
Yes, I think it can. There are a lot of advantages in other energy industries, low emissions industries in being in the Latrobe Valley, simply because the infrastructure is there. It costs an awful lot to put it anywhere else, so it's an advantage to be there. There are a lot of footloose low carbon activities generating electricity that would make sense there. One, you mentioned using the region as a big battery storage. Well, the cheapest form of storage is pumped hydro storage, and it's worth looking at whether some of the deep pits could be used for pumped hydro. The idea there is when the wind's blowing at night or the sun's blasting away in the middle of the day and not using all the power, you can pump water from a dam down in the pit to another one at the top, and then the pump can become a generator when it works in reverse. The technology of that is very well developed now, and so then you get the power when you need it. The next thing I'm going to say is not popular with all people who love renewable energy, but I think there's a case for continuing to work with carbon capture and storage, which can be, in some favourable circumstances, a competitive form of zero carbon electricity. But the thing that makes it most attractive to me is that it's a pathway to negative emissions electricity, because if you are capturing, or if you're using biomass like a gum tree, a plantation gum tree, to feed a power generator, and you're able to capture the emissions and then store them somewhere, then you're actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And I'm worried that we'll need to take quite a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere because we're not moving fast enough.
Can I just get the microphone back down to Wendy for a second? Because Wendy, you know, it's great that you've come up from Morwell tonight, and thank you for that. And I know there are other people here from Latrobe Valley, and that's great that you're here. Just as someone who actually lives and breathes, literally, unfortunately, sometimes that was a poor analogy, but you know, a community that is really built around coal. What is the general feeling amongst your community about what appears to be the inevitability of closing down coal-fired power stations? Is that viewed on with trepidation, or tell those of us who live here in Melbourne how you view it?
All right, you upset me when you asked that question. Okay, the community is really fearful for what the future holds for Latrobe Valley. We do have 90 years of history of supplying the state, and Victoria is what it is because of Latrobe Valley. So, you know, it would be really good to put that pressure on our state and federal politicians to be saying, well, these guys have supplied the state for power. Let's look after them and make sure that any innovation centre or any new technology can be created there. You know, our kids will have jobs that we cannot even imagine. We need to be training those kids for those jobs. And Latrobe Valley is, you know, doing it hard. You know, after the fire that they're doing it very hard. But going back to 1990, the area was displaced. You know, the government promised when they privatised that it would be good for Latrobe Valley, and it wasn't. We saw the downfall, and we've seen it continue. So unless something happens and it is looked after, I actually fear, and I think a lot of people fear for it. So instead of displacing a community more, and this goes for any other community that is a coal mining community, we need to think about how we can work forward with those communities, moving those communities to something rather than away from something.
And I'm sure you'd like the support of people in this room to do that as well, to get on board with
Absolutely.
that.
I think it's a whole state's responsibility.
Thank you.
Can I just weigh in briefly on that? So, I mean, Australia has a history of doing structural adjustment really badly. We tend to kind of close our eyes to the end of an industry until, hang on, it's gone. Oh, let's shove a little bit of money their way. Maybe we'll do a little bit of training, even though, now it's kind of a little bit late in the piece. So we're arguing that we should not do that, and that it will be much better for communities like the people of Morwell, like people in Port Augusta, who had to deal with the sudden snap closures of plants that they didn't think were going to be shutting down for quite a long time. It's going to be much better if we actually plan that transition, and also that we recognise that people who are literally on the coalface of this transition have the right to be first in line to benefit from the growth of renewables and of energy efficiency. So there are ways that you can design policies that do mean that, okay, if you're running a clean energy auction for storage technologies to balance out variable renewables, then you could actually run a specific auction where the places like the Latrobe Valley or like Port Augusta that are really, really good candidates for having storage because they are at that right point in the grid, that could be one of the criteria that you look at when you decide whether to actually place those technologies.
Well,
in those
exactly.
places.
And I mean, there's an opportunity there to be able to pick up on new developments. I mean, I think you mentioned about the batteries side of it, the storage part of it. The story is only just beginning, in my view. I mean, we're just looking at what households can access, and we think, 7 kilowatt hours, that type of capacity. But if you actually start to look at a whole range of emerging sort of developments in the battery technology space, we can actually start to look at flow batteries and other alternatives where you might be looking at larger capacities. So, I mean, suddenly you're sort of saying, well, if we are going to trial and test bed emerging solutions, why not put those types of emerging solutions with battery technologies that allow you to look at larger and larger capacities? So you could well be, looking at the developments and the trial and the test bed, and the place where that happens should be logically where you're sort of transitioning from the old into the new developments. That's important.
Okay, we should have a question from up the front. I think have you got one there? Okay, all right.
About 10 years ago, two of Melbourne's greatest thinkers, David Spratt and Phil Sutton, wrote a book called Climate Code Red. Last week, Bernie Sanders in the States breathed a little bit of life into the climate emergency concept. I'm just wondering if any of the panel heard what Bernie Sanders said last week, are familiar with what was written in Climate Code Red 10 years ago, and would like to comment on that.
All right, just a quick answer on this one. Thanks, guys.
Look, I thought Climate Code Red was great, and yes, if we were treating the climate crisis as the emergency that it is, we'd be going a whole lot faster than 100% renewable power by 2030, and I certainly hope that we can do that, and some of the innovative stuff that Vina's talking about probably means we could do it. The reality is, I mean, if we were actually treating the fact that we've got a planetary emergency on our hands in the kind of same way that we treat like security risks, any other security risk, any other risk to our life and our health, then we would be going all guns blazing. We would have a World War II style mobilisation. What the modelling that we've released today shows is that even the absence of that, very necessary wake-up call, there are a whole lot of sound reasons to make this transition quite fast anyway.
Okay, down the back, and then we'll have one up the front.
So there's no secret that the mining industry, as well as the energy groups, have a lot of money invested in the political stage in Australia. Are lobby groups and the sentiments in this room strong enough to shift the power base? And if not, are industries needed, then what does that look like?
I'm not going to ask you, Miriam, because that's a loaded question for you. Ross, how about from you?
Yeah, I think that the community is stronger in our democracy than the vested interests, but our political leaders don't know it, and they are too easily frightened by the pressures. If you look at the exit polling after the last election about after the scare campaign about carbon pricing from Tony Abbott. For most voters, including voters for the coalition, the carbon price was not a big issue, and for those for whom it was a big issue, a big majority preferred carbon pricing or an emissions trading scheme over the government's policies. I think that our political leaders, those who wanted to do something about climate change, were a bit too frightened by the noisy pressures that were against them. If they'd stood up better to that pressure, appealed over the heads of the vested interests of the community, I think there's a base of support there.
And Veena, you deal a lot with business people as well, don't you, in that capacity? What about from them?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's interesting, you put aside the political part of the conversation, you come really to the things that we've been talking about, where the real change and innovation is ultimately going to come where there's a genuine partnership between research and industry sectors. And I think that's exactly what has been happening in so many different ways, which I think, again, the reason why a lot of these advances that I'm talking about have actually emerged is because of that type of collaboration, that genuine collaboration where industry partners who are believers in new technologies, who do know that future lies in looking at where emerging technologies are going to ultimately be not just good for the environment, but ultimately going to be cost effective. So there are enough sort of passionate people who understand science and technology and the importance of continuing to go down that path and being world leaders in technological advances in industry. So I think it really does go to show that in a lot of the work that has been happening, not just at the Smart Centre where we are at UNSW, but also in a whole range of other universities, where it just goes to show that there is a lot of support from businesses who do believe that we've got to play a role in investing in R&D. And of course, I'm not saying that that's enough, and by certainly no means that that's enough, and we need to be able to do more. But the fact that there are businesses willing to be the first in the world to pick up on a lot of new science that's coming out of smart researchers in Australia, and to be able to push that forward, I think that's a really critical thing for us to be looking at.
And just back to that funding question, how much are you funded by government versus how much are you actually funded by the private sector or through philanthropics or?
Sure. So if you look at the Australian Research Council, so the ARC, which is the funding body, research funding body in Australia, they basically have got programs where you can effectively tap into funding for blue sky research. So they're their discovery grants that you can apply for as a researcher in the university sector. But you can also apply for research through the ARC, which is built on partnership with both government as well as industry. And I think if you actually look at that full spectrum, then really the importance of being able to do both fundamental and applied research is absolutely critical.
So just in terms of the ratio, before we quickly take another question, what is the ratio of government versus industry?
Right. So I mean, of course, that varies depending upon the kind of area you are from. If you're a pure scientist, a pure mathematician at one end of the spectrum, of course, you're basically relying entirely on blue sky research funding. If you're a bit leaning towards, like myself, into a combination of science, technology, commercialization, the application side of the spectrum, in our case, it's half-half. So we certainly still rely very, importantly on getting half of funding through the blue sky type of work. Very important for us to do that. And the other half would be from industry support. And look, if it weren't for that kind of blue sky funding, the kind of things that we're doing, commercializing our green steel technology, which was funded by ARC first and foremost, as a blue sky piece of work, that would have never come to life. So I think it is very important that we recognize that both are equally important.
Okay. Question up the front. Who was the...
I suppose I've come here this evening to challenge your panel and to challenge everybody in this room.
Good. Let's hear it.
I've put solar panels right down the north-facing roof of my home. I've got solar hot water. I've bought an electric car. I have an electric bicycle. I have an electric rechargeable motor mower. I'm totally committed to solar energy. But just to show you how very smart I am and clever, I went up to our local council and said, I'm going to be devastated if somebody comes and builds on my north side. And they gave me lots of platitude and said, don't worry, you'll be okay, you'll be taken care of. The developers come in from overseas, brought the property next door and is extending upwards. There's no planning permit required. I don't know what their intention is. I've got no right of reply, no compensation, nothing. So I would suggest to you people, don't bother with solar energy.
Same happened to you? Who was saying that? Same deal. So someone came and blocked off your solar.
Fine to lose it.
Okay. So no redress of that. I mean, it doesn't appear that there's redress or councils or VCAT have
sounds like a
actually...
classic case in which policy is totally failing to keep up with the massive expansion of people who are basically trying to do the right thing, yeah? So we need them to catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question. Where were we? There's too many questions. I'm going to have to get the ushers to choose, otherwise...
Look, I'd like to address two things, something old and something new. Ross mentioned that one of the best ways to store energy is in fact in water, and we have had a system that does that, which is not far away from the Latrobe Valley, and that's up in the Snowy scheme. We have a repumped hydro system, and that could certainly be expanded there or elsewhere. So that's the first thing. There are old things. That's been running for 3 generations, and although I'm committed to new technology, I don't think we're ready to throw out the old stuff yet. I've still got a wheelbarrow. I think some of you might as well. It's still useful. Now, the other thing is that we're on the verge of throwing out something which is old and new. I referred to the aluminium smelter at Portland. We went there recently and it's surrounded by windmills. There's not enough windmills to power the smelter, but there's a tremendous amount of energy that goes into creating aluminium. And it's very difficult to pick up solar and carry it from here to Asia or anywhere else. But there's no problem for us because we've got huge bauxite deposits. We've got the carbon that's necessary for the electrodes, and we've got plenty of solar and wind nearby. Now, if that smelter in fact closes, and it might do because of short-term economic circumstances, we lose a terrific opportunity to do as this gentleman over here said, and that is to produce more than 100%. Okay.
Well,
comments,
I mean,
please.
You know, it's interesting you talk about, you know, where that aluminium can come from, and you referred to rightfully the smelter, but you've got to also remember there are lots and lots of end-of-life materials that are available to us. And let me give you a simple example that everyone would be familiar with: coffee capsules that are made out of, you know, aluminium. Now you might sort of basically go, well, you know, what happens to those types of resources? And that's just one example. You know, I was sort of showing you my electronic waste, you know, little pearls. I love them. But I guess the point in all of this is, you know, we've got to start to think about resources in a much more holistic manner, not just the raw materials that come out of the ground, but the end-of-life products. Because if you still look at aluminium that can come from these secondary resources, you still need some amount of energy to reform and transform them into new aluminium products. I mean, you're absolutely right, but you actually only need 5% of the energy that you needed if you are processing ores in the first place. So it makes a lot of sense for us to be able to actually use secondary resources if you can possibly help it.
Ross, just really briefly from you, then we'll go to the back, and then can I have the question up here on the corner, please?
Australia, in the low-carbon world economy, if we play our cards right, we'll have a big competitive advantage in all energy-using industries, including the old industries like aluminium, and including a lot of new industries that are needed to service the renewable energy industries, like silicon, which needs a lot of power to put into photovoltaic panels, including clean ammonia to replace fossil fuel-based ammonia, including hydrogen to fuel transport and power generators in countries like Japan, that don't have renewable resources.
And so we could be
Absolutely.
exporting those high-value materials out to the rest of the world to manufacture that kind of infrastructure, and better yet, manufacture it ourselves if we can possibly do it, if we can be smart about how we use our resources, both energy as well as materials.
Yeah, in the
All
same
right,
way
we've
that
got-
Iceland's been doing with geothermal, all we have to do is break the power of the fossil fuel lobby and we can have a forward-looking industrial policy instead of one
We've
that
got
looks back.
literally 3 minutes left. I've got a little clock here that ticks down that tells me. So we'll have that very quick question and then quick answer and then one final question at the front.
Sure, yeah. My question is for Ross and the panel more broadly, and it regards the equity of technological take-up. So electricity is expensive, so we buy solar panels and batteries, and then we pay less money to the grid, and then they increase their costs to recoup the cost that they put in. So electricity becomes more expensive, more people go off the grid, and the people who are left on the grid, the people who are renting houses or don't have the roof space or don't have the capital to buy solar panels. So my question is, what ways do you guys see forward for making the transfer to future technology more equitable?
It's a really good question.
Well, there's a really big problem if we accept that we just have to continue to give a very high rate of return to past wasteful investment in the grid. We'll have to write off a lot of that. A lot of that 87 billion was just wasted. At the moment, the network companies are guaranteed a very high rate of return. There's no other investment like it for what is a low-risk investment. And that's just added on to power bills, and as you say, as some people generate power on their own, it increases the cost of the others. We're going to have to write down to a realistic, to an economically efficient level, the cost of the grid. There's a question of what's the best way to pay for that. One way or another, we've got to write down a lot of that wasteful overinvestment.
I'm all for that. We've also got 3 other ideas on how you would deal with that. One is to introduce new rules that basically make network companies save their customers money instead of wasting it by helping to reduce demand at peak times instead of just letting it rip and hope that they get to have a license to print money on ever more poles and wires. So Ross is kind of talking about how to deal with the problem that we have had. That's how to prevent that problem from happening again, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Another is that there are already 80 amazing community energy projects across Australia that are doing a great job of extending both renewable access but also energy efficiency to people that might otherwise be locked out of it. So there's projects like the Darebin Solar Savers project run by the Moreland Energy Foundation, which basically allows low-income pensioners to get solar paid for by the council and then pay the council back on their rates out of the savings they make on their bills.
And do you have links to all of that stuff in your report?
Yeah, it's all in the Homegrown
okay.
Power Plan.
Excellent.
Go to getup.org.au, you can download it.
I've just promised the final question here in the corner, so I must do that before we leave.
Thank you to the Wheeler Centre and the panellists for a very optimistic discussion this evening, but sometimes optimism meets reality and it doesn't always work out. Exporting power to Asia, I was in Tasmania a couple of months ago and we couldn't export power to Tasmania. So gold-plated power lines. I attended a day of the hearing of the lawsuit for the Black Saturday bushfires, and the arguments there was that the power lines weren't in as good enough condition. So, what's the answer there? Tim Flannery suggested that hot rocks technology was going to be a go. Geodynamics got a $90 million grant from the government. The hole's been filled in, the $90 million is gone. Geodynamic shares are 3 cents now instead of $2 or $3. Solyndra in the US blew $500 million. Ross, do you have any ideas on how we can pick winners instead of losers?
No, the way the market works, people invest in winners and losers, and the winners and losers in the fossil industries as well. No, I think if you'd put your money into a representative sample of pure coal companies around the world 5 years ago, they'd be worth 95% less than you paid for them. And yes, there are losers in renewable energy and the new technologies. I think that's part of change. We just have to accept that We need to have businesses experiment with a lot of new technologies, a lot of new things. Some will end up like Microsoft, and some will end up like Peabody Coal. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Did you want to have the last word on that, Vina, working as you do in innovation?
Certainly, it sort of comes back to, of course, market forces. I mean, that's an important point, as Ross made. But I think the role for innovation, cannot be underestimated, because I think this is where we've got to be able to look at I referred to the amazing R&D before that happens in Australia. But I think where we need to be smart is how do we then translate that R&D into practical outcomes? And I think piloting and moving them up rapidly and not just randomly picking losers and winners, but to be able to say, let's allow R&D to move quickly into some test phase mode, and let's evaluate so that we can actually then, based on hard facts and data, pick winners. I think it's important. So we also know which ones are the technologies that are not going to work. It's okay to fail, but to be able to recognize that early is important. So I think if we've got R&D, let's not be shy about translating that into actual practical outcomes, trial, test, evaluate, move forward, make quick decisions, and I think that's the way we'll be able to be really smart about how we convert R&D into real outcomes.
Thank you. We're going to have to leave it there because we have run over time tonight, and I do apologise for that, but it's because you all had so many good questions and you were such an active audience, so thank you very much for that. And can you please thank our panel, Miriam Lyons, Ross Garno and Vina Sahajwala.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.